What are the essential tenets of leadership? Can we boil down the key leadership attributes to two or three that are absolutely foundational for all of us, that are effective in every situation, in every circumstance, for every person? And the answer is yes. There are, in fact, three crucial and inviolable leadership principles or tenets. And we're going to discover those today. Learning these lessons in history, we're going to learn about three stories, each of which underscores and highlights a leadership principle. These are three stories from history, three characters in history, and three examples that'll teach us about leadership. We go way back in time for our first story, all the way back to ancient Persia. Some 2,500 years ago, there was an extraordinary empire that centered around Persia, stretched across three continents, ruled by a great emperor, his name Cyrus. Cyrus the Great headed an empire that was the envy of the world, one of the most powerful empires that had ever been seen on the face of this planet. And what Cyrus did to showcase his immense power was to start an astonishing array of architectural monumentality. And these architectural monuments endure to this very day, showcasing the strength and the vitality of the empire at its peak. But there was something else that Cyrus did that sets him apart as a leader, that elevates his stature above other emperors that lived at the same time or that came later. And that was one unique action that he undertook, an episode that reverberates through history. He allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland and help them start building their temple. You see, the Jews were very different from Cyrus's own people. They worshipped a different God from the God that Cyrus worshipped. And yet, Cyrus displayed an extraordinary attribute that was very rare today, that is very rare today, and it was even rarer at that time. And that attribute is empathy. Empathy, of course, is the quality of being able to see the world from the eyes, from the perspective of the other person. And in an era that was defined by bloodlines and tribal allegiances, empathy was an extraordinarily rare attribute. Cyrus showed empathy when he let the Jews return to their homeland from their exile in Babylon. And this example of empathy that Cyrus demonstrated is a paradigmatic example of leadership that has enshrined his name among the greatest leaders of history. He's been praised by Fortune 500 CEOs, by the American founding fathers, and most extraordinarily, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, the prophet Isaiah calls Cyrus a Messiah. He confers on Cyrus a messianic attribute of leadership. And this is unique because Cyrus is the only non-Jewish person who's singled out for this kind of praise in the Old Testament. And Cyrus has left us an enduring lesson in empathetic leadership. So that was our first story. And from ancient Persia, we now time travel to 16th century Europe. This was a time in Europe just after the Protestant Reformation, when there was intense bloodshed, tragedy, turbulence, and turmoil all over Europe. Protestants and Catholics were killing each other, slaughtering each other, beheading each other, torturing each other in the name of religion. And against this backdrop of this blood-soaked rivalries between the different parts of European Christians, a ship sailed across the Mediterranean Sea and docked into the harbor of Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was at the time one of the most powerful empires, not only in Europe, but all over the world. Just 150 years earlier, the Ottoman Empire had captured Constantinople and ended the 1,000-year reign of the Eastern Roman Empire. This massive ship that had just docked in Constantinople had sailed from England and was carrying the English ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. Mustafa Selanik'i Effendi was a contemporary chronicler of the Ottoman Empire, and he was known for his very meticulous records of eyewitness accounts. He gives us an eyewitness account of the arrival of this ship and notes that there were 3 astonishing facts about this ship that carried the English ambassador. Selanik'i Effendi wrote, the first astonishing fact was that the ship had sailed some 3,720 miles nonstop to reach the shores of the Ottoman Empire. The second astonishing fact that he wrote down at the time was that the ship was equipped with not 1, not 2, not 10, not 20, not 50, but 83 guns, all arrayed in a firing position. Effendi writes that a ship of this caliber, a warship this mighty, so spectacularly attired with weaponry, had never been seen in the world at that time. But it was a third fact that Effendi found to be most astonishing about this ship. The third fact, he said, was that the monarch who had dispatched this ship from England was a woman. And he was, of course, talking about Queen Elizabeth I, who had ascended to the throne of England during a time of turmoil and tragedy against the backdrop of the Reformation in Europe. And on this ship, of course, was the English ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. But along with the ambassador, she had sent a unique document. This was a document that was a proposal for a military alliance with the Ottoman Empire. And what is extraordinary about this proposal, this unusual proposal for a military alliance, was the centerpiece of this proposal, this letter that the ambassador carried with him to the Sultan. And here's what the Queen said in this letter. We Protestant English, she was saying on behalf of her citizens, we Protestant English are just like you, Your Excellency, Sultan Murad III. Our churches are free of idols and statues and images and icons, just like your mosques. And in this, she wrote, we are very different from the idol worshiping, icon worshiping, polytheistic Catholics. So let us join forces in a military alliance against the Catholics. Now, this letter was astonishing in its conceit, in its deceitfulness, deceptiveness. Of course, it's nominally true that Protestant churches were free of idols and icons and statues. But in saying that, she was papering over the massive gulf, the difference that existed between Christians and the Sunni Muslims of the Ottoman Empire. But what she was doing was preying, P-R-E-Y, preying on the insecurity and the ignorance of the Sultan about the events that were transpiring all across Europe. She sought out and obtained this unusual military alliance that became the cornerstone of the rise of the English Empire and the British Empire in the succeeding centuries. This was a military alliance that stood the test of time, stretched across 4 centuries from the 16th to the 20th century. And it was instrumental in the ascension of England as the most powerful nation in the world by the mid-19th century. And there were 3 things that Elizabeth got out of this military alliance. Number 1, she formed a common front against Catholic European countries, and she was surrounded by Catholic Europe, Portugal and Spain and France and Genoa and Venice and Sicily. And she formed this alliance with the Ottoman Empire against all of those countries. The second advantage was she was able to keep Russia at bay. And thirdly, and most importantly, the alliance with the Ottoman Empire allowed English traders free reign, free access through the Middle East on to their routes, trading routes to the East, especially India. English traders were able to travel unmolested by Arabs who were allies of the Ottoman Empire, able to establish trading posts in India and start an extraordinary journey that would result in the massive and mighty British Empire reaching its pinnacle in the 19th century. The English-Ottoman alliance was the centerpiece, the foundation of the spectacular rise of England as the most powerful country in the world by the middle of the 19th century. And this was accomplished by this shrewd communication that Elizabeth showed. She showed the example of communication in 2 ways. Unwritten communication through the dispatch of this massive warship equipped with 83 guns, and written communication, which was this proposal that she sent to the Sultan, which was simultaneously breathtaking in its deceitfulness and a masterstroke of diplomacy. That was our second example. From 16th century Europe, we now travel to New York of the 1890s for our third story. Jeanette Thurber was a New York socialite, a wife of a wealthy man. Her vision was to establish a music school, a classical music school, a conservatory in New York, in the United States, because no such music school for classical music existed in the United States up until that point in time. And in order to fulfill this vision of hers, which she was very passionate about, she recruited one of the most famous composers of the time, a Czech composer named Antonin Dvorak. She invited him and his family to New York to settle down, to teach, and to compose. He accepted the offer, came to New York, and started teaching and recruiting. This school that they opened, the New York Conservatory, was unusually for its time, allowed the admission of African Americans. And here at this place, Antonin Dvorak was surrounded for the first time by African Americans, people he had never known before. And while interacting with them, teaching them, composing them side by side with them, he became aware of their music. The music that they were singing, they were humming, they were strumming, these unusual but distinctive melodies, which of course were old African-American melodies, music lines, musical history, musical heritage that had been passed down through their ancestors that had come to the United States on slave ships some 1 or 2 centuries earlier. In this music, Dvorak saw the seeds of a great school of music, a great paradigm of music. He started encouraging them to start composing in their own way. Dvorak became aware of this type of music, this African-American music, and became absolutely convinced that the future of American music was not in European imports, but in this music that was born out of this native land in the United States, created by these people who were living in the United States, who had nourished this and held on to this music for so long. In fact, he gave an interview to a newspaper in 1892. And this was an incredible statement that he would go on to make. I'm going to quote from this newspaper interview that Antonin Dvorak gave in 1892. I am now satisfied that the future music of this country must be founded upon what are known as Negro melodies. This must be the real foundation of any serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. In the Negro melodies of America, I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. This was an incredible statement. He was essentially giving a public vote of confidence to this kind of music that had been sidelined before. It was just a small part of the American musical scene up to that point. But this strong voice of approbation from a famous European composer at the time gave an incredible boost of confidence to the African-American musicians of the time. And they started composing in their own style. In fact, the first batch of Dvorak students mentored and taught the early jazz greats like Duke Ellington. Dvorak's championing of African-American music and his fervent and ardent belief that it is within this school of African-American music that the future of American music lies was instrumental in what became nothing less than a musical revolution that would take place in the United States in the 20th century, beginning with gospel music, spiritual melodies, and then ragtime and blues and jazz and rock and roll. This music swept the world in the 20th century and became the most recognizable and distinctive form of American music ever. And of course, all of this was foreseen by Antonin Dvorak in the instinctive awareness that he had about the greatness and the potential that lie in this kind of music. He did not live to see all this, but his awareness and indeed his clairvoyance is undeniable. My friends, we've looked at three important lessons about leadership from history. From Emperor Cyrus the Great, we learned about the importance of empathy. From Queen Elizabeth I, the crucial importance of communication. And of course, she demonstrated both unwritten and written communication. And finally, from Antonin Dvorak, the importance of awareness, awareness of self, awareness of your surroundings, awareness of your environment. These three attributes, these three tenets, these three virtues form the very cornerstone of leadership. I submit to you that one cannot be a leader if one does not have and possess and demonstrate these three attributes of leadership. And you can use a simple acronym to remember them: awareness, communication, and empathy. These are what you might call necessary but not sufficient principles of leadership. No matter your station in life, no matter your vocation or the organization, we would all do well to keep these three attributes in mind, embrace them, enact them, and remember them. Because after all, they've stood the test of time. This is something that we should keep in mind. Thank you.